Pentagon officials tell me that U.S. and Arab warplanes struck about 12 small oil refineries, modular refineries, that were being used by ISIS in eastern Syria. These are facilities that were producing $1 to $2 million in revenue a day for ISIS, or about 300 to 500 barrels of oil. The refined oil was used for fighters to fuel their vehicles, as well as revenue for salaries. They tried to avoid destroying the facilities, I'm told, so that friendly forces could come in and occupy them.
We have reached the next inevitable stage in fighting any war. The enemy's been hit hard. They now begin to retaliate in their own fashion. The next step must involve an even harder edge tactic, while at the same time keeping an eye on what is happening here and around the world to civilians, and those who will stop at nothing to keep a world gripped in fear. Let's welcome back to MidPoint, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs, Chairman of the Board at the Stimson Center, Lincoln Bloomfield, Jr. Lincoln, thank you so much for being here today.
Ed, my pleasure.
I want to begin by playing a soundbite here. This is Ziad Abdelnour. He is a veteran businessman in the Middle East. He has appeared on this show many times. He knows a lot of the political tactics there as well. When he came on the show back on August 29th, he said the only way to defeat ISIS was to burn the oil fields. Here's what he said.
We should dismantle all their methods of communications, all their control of all resources, financial resources. The banks who accept the money, the ISIS money or the Syrian money, should be shut down or banned. The oil fields should be burned. You know, this is not going to affect the world markets if you burn this oil. They control a very small part.
Excuse me, just 1 minute here, but are you talking about burning the oil fields in Syria?
Yes, and whatever oil fields that ISIS controls in Iraq.
Lincoln, the thinking there was to burn them, no matter where they are, but basically take them out, all refineries of any size. What's your take, knowing now that we have gone after some of the refineries?
Well, I think that we have started something, as you said, in teeing up this segment. What I'd like to focus on is the bigger picture, the long-range picture. Why is this happening? The sweep of history is that populations are becoming more and more free. But in the Middle East, if you talk about $2 million a day for ISIS, look at Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. They had tens of billions of dollars essentially stolen from their people. And governance has been a real challenge for decades in the Arab world. That's why you had the Arab Spring. That's why you had the Persian Spring in 2009 in Tehran, because of authoritarian governments that were not allowing their population to speak. So the good news is you had young people aspiring through social media to have something better. The bad news is the dark edge of that social media was ISIS. And I understand what the gentleman's tactic is, but we need to think long term. How do we win in this situation? Well, those towns in eastern Syria that Assad regime is never going to govern again. They've basically barrel bombed them, they've given up on them. But someday someone has to live there. So I appreciate that the Pentagon is trying to avoid destroying the infrastructure. Maybe they talked about hitting trucks, leaving the infrastructure, so that someday when ISIS is defeated, a Syrian population can come in and govern themselves and live without us having to pay for 10 new refineries.
Understanding, and that certainly was one of my questions to him about what happens in the long term. However, is it not fair to say that when you are at this point in a war and you have to cut off the head of the snake somewhere, at least to start somewhere, that the president perhaps did the right thing and going after these fields is at least a good start?
Yes, I mean, I think that the President and the United States taking action sends a powerful strategic signal. It says we are going to push back on this dark trend. It also, by bringing in coalition and Arab coalition forces, sends a very powerful message that we are connected as allies with the Syrian friends throughout the Gulf, and so we are together. This defeats a strategic objective coming from Tehran. If you look at the bigger picture, Ed, if you'll indulge me,
please.
The problem here is that, you know, ISIS was created by the Assad regime, and Syrian diplomat who came to Washington and told the entire story. You hear this from many sides. The Assad regime was about to be taken out of power in Geneva. We were leading the charge. The president drew a red line. That was 2 or 3 years ago. Now he's fine, and the reason he's fine is that he started a bonfire. He opened the door to these extremists. He diverted our attention. He had Iran's full support in doing this. In Iraq, they tried to do the same thing with Nouri al-Maliki, But because the Sunni part of the Iraqi army essentially wouldn't fight ISIS, but steered them toward Baghdad and the Maliki regime, Maliki couldn't hold on. And so now you have the Iranians essentially on their back foot. This is the larger strategic picture is, Tehran is trying to build essentially an iron fist against Israel on the northern border with Hezbollah. They're trying to keep Assad in power. They're trying to control the Sunni part of Iraq, which is the majority and which has the prime ministership. And right now they're in some trouble. The difference between what ISIS represents, when you take away the media, is basically a small, violent gang. It's like the FARC in Colombia. It is not if you take away all of the broadcasting of their videos, which seem to be more important than how many casualties they're incurring, they become something much less.
Do you then disagree with those who say that this is, and we've had it said many times here on the show as well, this is a very intelligent group, this is a large group? It seems as if you're sort of tamping that down a little bit.
Well, I don't see people who come from, Libya and Algeria and Pakistan and Yemen leading villages politically in Syria 5-10 years from now. I don't think anyone who is Syrian believes that either. They're interlopers. And it's really ironic that the Assad regime, which absolutely kept control and eyes on everyone who crossed their borders for 30 or 40 years, would suddenly allow all these people in and empty their jails, by the way, when ISIS started to get active. So do I think it is a permanent force? No. But look at the template they're following. It's a caliphate. It's a religious power. It is. They have a case where if you don't follow what they say, if you don't follow their exact religious tenets, if you call it religion, they will kill you. They'll take action against you. They're stealing all the means of economy. They're providing some support to the population as hostages. We've seen this movie before, Ed. It was Tehran, 1979. The big difference is the Iranians have concealed most of the action they've taken to imprison and execute their political dissidents. But it's the same thing. They also hid their nuclear program until it was discovered by their exiled opposition. So the big takeaway for ISIS is how much media they're getting. And I think I'd like to hear the president talk a little bit more, not about governments censoring, but about the population recognizing that these videos are absolutely the recruiting tool that ISIS is, and we're giving it to them for free.
Couple of minutes that we have left here. You brought Hafez al-Assad into this, of course, and what's happening in Syria. Would it be your opinion then that the larger picture here, the larger thought process going ahead is, seeing as we are now in Syria, to remain there, to do what we can, to start something and get Assad out of power, to change what's happening in Syria? Should that be a main goal?
Well, yes. And frankly, what we're saying in the president's speech was very good yesterday at the UN as far as it went. We stood for a lot of good things. We stood against a lot of bad things. But look at those things. For every one person ISIS has driven out of their town, Bashar al-Assad has driven 10. For every one person ISIS has killed, Bashar has killed 30. And even the Arab foreign ministers have called for the world to take him to the International Court of Justice to face war crimes prosecution. The Americans haven't spoken on that subject. So I do think we need to be clear. We've said we're going to fight it. Now we have to stand for something. We have to stand for principles. We have to insist that Syria be measured against those principles, and by the way, Iran, and by the way, the new government in Iraq.
With what we have started then, would it then be a fail, in your opinion, if, let's say, a year or two from now, Assad is still in power and the Iranians are still holding the world up for their nuclear rights?
No, because I look at these things as a much longer continuum. I mean, it took years, but Germany and Japan turned into our closest friends and the most successful economies and societies in the modern world. So good things can take time. I'm not saying that. We should still be on the Korean Peninsula with a lot of forces until such time as it's stable. That's a commitment we've made. We should be proud to uphold it. I think that we should set our principles, let the world know that we intend to do something. It doesn't mean we have to pour ground forces into Syria. It means we have to stand for something. And if you stand for something, just the way ISIS seems to be sending a very strong message, if they see our passion, what we stand for, I think we win. We win the Arab Spring, and I think we win in Syria long term.
About 20 seconds left then. However, let me just point this out. In your opinion, then, it would be at least to change the leadership in these two countries. One way or another, we're there. Let's get it started. Let's make sure that the end result is the leadership changes and the criminals are out. How's that?
Well, as an observer on the outside, rather than write their policy for them, I'd simply say, what kind of a policy is it if someone who has committed the most heinous war crimes using his state military power goes through without accountability? Whether it's today or tomorrow, the United States must be clear that certain things are acceptable, certain things are unacceptable. And once we get clear about that and we start planning for a world in which better governance it comes to root in the Middle East, however long that takes, that's the way we should think about it. And that way we will know what tactics to follow.
Lincoln Bloomfield Jr., always a pleasure. Thank